For months, the US and the EU have resisted calls to share their COVID-19 vaccine patents. But now Washington says it'll help developing countries gain access to the intellectual property, and Brussels has indicated it's also willing to follow suit. If approved, the measure could speed up the global rollout of the injections. But as Mobin Nasir reports, striking a deal and getting pharmaceutical companies to stick to it could take months.
After lining up for hours outside this inoculation centre in Mumbai, these people have been asked to return at a later date with promises that they will receive the coronavirus vaccine. As infections and fatalities continue to mount, more and more Indians are trying to get the jabs. The Asian nation is home to the world's largest vaccine manufacturing facility, and yet only 9% of its 1.4 billion people have been inoculated against COVID-19. Supplies were running so short that the country halted all vaccine exports in March. For months now, India and about 100 other developing nations have appealed for patent protections to be waived.
WHO joins countries around the world that are calling on vaccine manufacturers to remove obstacles that are preventing access to critical health products. We continue to call on companies to share know-how, intellectual property, and data with other qualified vaccine manufacturers, including in low and middle-income countries.
The US and the EU had initially resisted these calls and blocked negotiations over a temporary patent waiver at the World Trade Organization. But now Washington has had a change of heart.
Mr. President, are you going to back a waiver of the US at the WTO? Are you going to back that? Is the US government
Yes,
going to
I'm
back that?
talking about that later today, yes.
Brussels too says it's willing to share the technology needed to produce vaccines.
The European Union is also ready to discuss any proposal that address the crisis in an effective and pragmatic manner. And that's why we are ready to discuss how the US proposal for waiver on intellectual property protection for COVID vaccines could help achieve that objective.
Public health experts and humanitarian agencies have welcomed the announcement, saying it's a boost for vaccine equality and will narrow the gap between rich and poor nations' access to life-saving jabs. But pharmaceutical companies disagree. They say waiving the patents is not a practical solution and will only lead to disruption in the industry, sowing confusion among public and private partners, further weakening already strained supply chains, and increasing the number of counterfeit vaccines. Pushing approvals through the WTO is a cumbersome process, and it may be months before developing economies can begin producing their own supplies. So for billions of people in some of the world's worst-hit regions, the wait for a vaccine is far from over. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Well, let's get more on this now with Dr. Luke McDonagh in London. He is an intellectual property specialist and an assistant professor at the London School of Economics Law Department. Welcome to the program, Doctor. Now, India and South Africa, as we heard, first originally proposed this idea to temporarily lift these patent protections on COVID-19 vaccines. They say that in doing so, it could really speed up the production of vaccines across the globe. How have patents set this back? How have they prevented the swift production of vaccines?
Thank you for the very interesting question. So, your show is called Money Talks, and that ultimately is the key issue here. If you need to license a patent from a big pharmaceutical company, you usually will have to pay a hefty fee to do that. So the idea behind waiving intellectual property rights is to reduce the price potentially to zero for developing countries to use the intellectual property of pharmaceutical companies to develop their own generic versions of the vaccine. And it's worth pointing out that the vaccines that we have, in particular the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, these were developed using public funds. So the money has come from the state, it's come from the public, and pharmaceutical companies have benefited greatly from public funding. And so it is right that the intellectual property rights, the trade secrets, the monopolies that come out of all of these incredible research adventures and achievements, that those are made available to the global public, because after all, public money is what has brought us here.
Now, drug makers have come out swinging against this proposal. They argue that it won't actually speed up the production of these vaccines this year or next, which is when they're needed the most. They also say that their companies have taken big financial risks in investing in the research and development of these COVID-19 vaccines, and they say that by harming patent protections, that it will really, I guess, act as a disincentive for them to develop future vaccines and medications. What do you say to those arguments?
Thanks. Well, there's a lot there to unpack. On the first issue of will this make a difference? Well, there are companies out there in the developing world, in SEPTA in Bangladesh, or in the developed world. In Israel, you have Teva, in Canada, you have BioLice, companies that want to and have offered to manufacture these vaccines and have been rebuffed or have been unable to get a license. So there is manufacturing capacity out there that already exists that can be used. But there's another important point as well, which is that we simply do not have enough capacity in the world right now to vaccinate the whole global public. If there are more than 7 billion people in the world, most vaccines need 2 doses, so we need around 14 billion a year. We're nowhere near the capacity to produce that, which means we need to build more capacity. And the argument behind the waiver is that we should build that capacity and help to build it in developing countries. Because we've seen right now in India, which is one of the biggest vaccine manufacturers, there's no export happening of vaccines from India right now because of the national crisis there. And so neighboring countries that were relying on exports now are left in the lurch. So, we need enough capacity in the developing world to deal with the developing world's needs. The idea of the voluntary supply via COVAX, it simply is insufficient to the needs. On the point of innovation and the incentives for innovation, there's no doubt that R&D in the pharmaceutical industry is incredibly expensive. And it does require, a cost-benefit analysis. It does require a reward system in place, and that's why we have the patent system. But we need to emphasize that this is an exceptional situation. And as I said, the R&D in this particular field of COVID-19 vaccines has largely been de-risked already because so much public funding has gone into it already. And the Oxford vaccine was developed at a public institution. We know the funding was about 97% from public money from the UK, from the US, from the EU. The Moderna vaccine has also benefited hugely from public funding. So, the incentive to create these vaccines has very much come from public funding and from state government direction. So I don't particularly buy the argument that this limited waiver, which only applies to COVID vaccines, will have the negative impact that the pharmaceutical companies say that it will.
Now, this is shaping up to be potentially the first big international patent dispute since a clash over expensive HIV treatments back in the late 1990s, involving countries like Brazil and South Africa, which were really grappling with the AIDS epidemic. What happened then? Did we see any action or any lifting of patents in that dispute?
Thanks. I'm glad that you brought that up because it is a very important historical precedent for what could happen now. We're in a particularly dangerous point in the pandemic when the West is beginning to go back to normal. The US is more than 50% vaccinated now, at least 1 dose. The UK is around the same. Lots of countries are beginning to return to normal. There's a sense that the worst of the pandemic is behind us. That's the message that we're hearing here in the UK and in the US and other developed countries. Whereas in actual fact, the pandemic is worse than ever in the developing world. And this is precisely what happened during the AIDS crisis. As treatments made it more manageable in the West and the tide began to recede, it exploded in the developing world, particularly in Africa. And so we need to avoid the mistakes that were made during the 1990s. There, the pharmaceutical companies actually sued South Africa under Nelson Mandela sued his government to try to prevent the generic manufacture of HIV/AIDS medicines. Here, the pharmaceutical industry has an opportunity to, along with the United States, work together with developing countries to make sure that we have enough capacity to vaccinate the global public. There is a great danger that, because vaccines run out, because the protection runs out, Western countries will begin to buy up booster jabs towards the end of the year. And if that happens, that will push down the list to the developing countries once again. So building capacity in the developing world is what we need to do right now. And that's the lesson to learn from the AIDS pandemic.
Okay, Dr. Luke McDonagh from the London School of Economics, thank you so much for sharing your analysis with us on Money Talks.